If you really want to get into competitive Pokemon, you have to know the terminology, and some of the most important things to know are what checks and counters are. And in my last video, I said that Ogerpon with the Fire Mask is actually a check to Heatran, and I want to explain what that means. Now, checks and counters are a lot like check and checkmate in chess. Here, the White Queen has the Black King in check, but if the Black Rook moves up and blocks the White Queen, it's no longer in check, so there's things you can do to get out of the situation. But a counter in Pokemon is a lot more like a checkmate in chess. Here, no matter what the Black King does, it's going to get beaten by what's already on the board. So your best bet is to just go to the next game, aka switch to the next Pokemon. Because there's no getting out of this situation. That King's going down. Now this guy Heatran is a powerhouse. He is Steel and Fire type and has the ability Flash Fire, which means whenever he would take damage or an effect from a Fire type attack, he instead is immune to it and gets a boost to his own Fire type damage. Now down here it says checks and counters, and it lists Rotom Wash, Garchomp, and Dragonite. And these are Pokemon that when they're on the opponent's field, or on the opponent's team at all, you have to think twice about just sending in Heatran whenever. Because if these things come out or are already on the field, Heatran is probably unable to touch them and they'll be able to KO it really quickly. Let's take something like Scovillain, for example. Another grass and fire type, just like Ogerpon with the Fire Mask. Now, Scovillain is usually run on sun teams where you have the ability Sunny Day or Drought activated. That's because his speed gets doubled in the sun because of his ability, and also, he likes to terrestrialize into fire and use moves like Flamethrower to do ridiculous damage in the sun. But let's look at this setup real quick and see why Heatran is a counter to this Scovillain set. Scovillain is running Flamethrower, Solar Beam Protect, and Will-O-Wisp. Will-O-Wisp and Flamethrower are both fire type attacks, so regardless of the fact that this doesn't do damage, it still will activate Flash Fire on a Heatran. And Solar Beam is resisted by Steel and by Fire types, so Heatran takes 1/4 of the normal damage from this charge-up move. Basically, Scovillain can't touch Heatran. If Scovillain is on the field, or Heatran switches in against a Scovillain, Scovillain has to switch because it can't kill the Heatran. It's basically impossible unless the Heatran is already drastically damaged. And then Heatran just has to press some attack buttons, and Scovillain will get turned into Pepper Flakes. Now that was the explanation of a counter, but a check is a little bit different. Ogerpon, like I said in my last video, could be considered a check to Heatran because it doesn't always beat it out, but there's sets that it can run where it will usually win. Now the idea is that if you had a free switch in to get this thing on the battlefield, it would be able to turn around and KO a Heatran that's already out there. Now this thing has the same typing as Scovillain, Grass and Fire, but is able to counteract the things that make Heatran really strong. And part of that is because of her ability before she terrestrializes with the Fire Mask, which is Mold Breaker. Now, Mold Breaker is really interesting and not very straightforward. What it does is it causes your Pokemon's attacks to ignore the abilities that your opponent had. And on this list of things you can ignore is Flash Fire, so Heatran is now no longer immune to your Fire-type attacks, which Ogerpon loves to use, so now it's able to take a lot of damage in response. Suddenly, this thing having an immunity to Fire-type attacks becomes taking neutral damage because it's Fire and Steel. That's not to say there's no hope for Heatran, though. There is an item called Ability Shield, which blocks your ability from being interfered with by your opponent. And more importantly for our case, this affects abilities that ignore abilities. So things like Mold Breaker don't affect you anymore if you have an Ability Shield. Now, this is admittedly not the most current infographic, so we may see these items swap a little bit as Heatran might pick up Ability Shield to deal with Ogerpon. But that means it loses out on the ability to use Air Balloon, which gives it an immunity to ground-type attacks. Now, this means Heatran players have to pick. Do they want to be immune to ground-type attacks and fire-type attacks from Pokemon that aren't Ogerpon? Or do they want to use Ability Shield, meaning they can beat Ogerpon in response, but lose out to any ground-type attack? It's actually a cool situation where some people playing this Pokemon might shift how they play because of Ogerpon existing. And because Heatran players have choices, that means that Ogerpon is not a blanket counter. There's things Heatran can do to beat some sets of Ogerpon, and likewise, Ogerpon can pick different moves to beat different Heatran sets. You're not always going to want to run Stomping Tantrum to beat Heatran specifically. So hopefully this made a lot of sense. Yeah, because competitive Pokemon is really cool and also really complicated. Now, I'm definitely not the best player myself. I don't play like on a competitive level, but I have been playing for decades and I know a lot about it. I'm a big nerd about this stuff. So if you want to see more videos about these topics, let me know.